Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of From the Other Sideline. I'm Melissa Tre'vius, your host, joined this week by Ryan Roberts of RiseNDraft.com. We're going to preview a little bit of TC's NFL draft prospects, talk some Senior Bowl, and some other goodies for some future pro frogs. Ryan, thank you so much for taking a few minutes and chatting with me.
Absolutely, Melissa. Thank you so much for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, you are a guy who gets deep in the weeds on the NFL draft, among some other things that you participate in with Notre Dame and some other college football programs. But you were paying close attention to the Senior Bowl, and there were quite a few TC draft prospects that were prominently featured in that game, notably Max Duggan. Obviously, Dee Winters had a great week, it seemed, down in Mobile. Steve Avila was another one, and then we'll talk about one player who wasn't a part of the game. But let's start with the quarterbacks, because you are a Davey O'Brien voter, and so you are somebody who's probably been following Max's career, especially over the last 2 months or so. His practices were outstanding. His game performance left a little bit to be desired. How much did Max help himself this week, and what do you kind of expect for his draft process to look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's always fascinating for quarterbacks because more often than not, it's not as much of what do you see just when the practice reps start, right? Where you see him in individual and teamwork. And I mean, all that stuff matters, of course. But it more importantly for Max, I think it was a big opportunity for him to get down to Mobile and just get on the whiteboard, be able to sit down with the evaluators that will be making those decisions now in only a couple of months of if he is a good fit into their organization. So I think that there is a quarterback evaluation in general is just such a fickle thing because it really, I mean, I could watch a guy on film and just, you can come to a conclusion on him, but there's so many things behind the scenes that matter, the leadership qualities, the ability to really mold himself into a locker room and be a great teammate and to be a leader from day one, right? Because those things are all very assumed of quarterbacks. So I think from everything that I've heard, Max is a wonderful young man and a guy that was, I mean, he went through the ringer a little bit at TCU. He started a lot, lost his starting job to Chandler Morris to begin the year. Of course, Chandler gets injured, and then Max goes on to be a Heisman finalist and Davey O'Brien Award finalist, right? So, I mean, he did a tremendous job this year. And I think the biggest impact that he had this week in Mobile is just, again, the ability to sit down with those evaluators, sit down with those coaches, and to really tell his story. Because at the end of the day, for Max as a potential, more than likely backup quarterback at the next level, probably a day three type of football player, those things matter so much because the reason that he's going to stick around to an organization is because of the character he has, also on top of the ability that he has as a football player.
Yeah, and I think that's, you bring up a really good point, is that we talk about this all the time with some of these less highly rated prospects coming out of high school, or the more tape you have can be a blessing, it can be a curse. And it feels like with Max, those first 3 years of reps probably were a little bit of a curse, but this year getting that extra year of film where he actually performed at a high level throwing the football certainly helped him. And it's interesting because I think the cerebral part of his game is something that's a little bit underrated because of the systems that he's played in. He wasn't asked to do a whole lot in the previous renditions of the TCU offense, and then Sonny Dykes' offense is so much read and react, it feels like. And so, do you think that he has, the playbook knowledge, the knowledge of the game, the cerebral approach of a quarterback to stick around for a long NFL career?
I do. I think that there's a little bit of a cap on just how good Max can be on the next level. Like I just don't envision starting quarterback in the NFL down the road for him. I just don't see it. But I do see a guy that, I mean, people hate these cliches, right? But he's a tough dude, man. Like he is one of those guys that will run through a wall. He really will. I mean, you saw in the Big 12 championship game, of course, they came out on the wrong end. But I mean, my guy was willing his way to try to win that football game and nearly pulled it out when he didn't have anything left in the tank. And that stuff is paramount to NFL teams. You can trust Max Duggan to whatever situation he's thrown in. He's going to give it his best effort. He's going to try to keep you afloat, and he's going to be tough doing it, right? So he might not be the most physically gifted player in terms of, pure arm strength, arm talent, that type of conversation. But the fact that he just has so much resolve in him to be able to work through, the negative situations that he was put through, and the ability to be a gamer. Again, I hate those cliches, but that's what Max Duggan is. So those things all together, I would be surprised if he didn't stick around for a few years as a backup quarterback, because I just think he has so many of those intangible things that we talk about so much, the toughness, the intelligence. And playing under Sonny Dykes for a year isn't going to hurt him, because Sonny Dykes is a very well-respected offensive mind. NFL teams respect him, and I'm sure that he's going to have the seal of approval from a Sonny Dykes in his lone year, because of just how well Max played as a senior.
Well, you look at guys like, Chad Henne or Chase Daniels, who have had really long NFL careers, who haven't often been asked to be a starter. But if you're playing in a 17-game season, more than likely you're going to need a backup that can come in, that can lead a drive, maybe in the playoffs, a 98-yarder like Henne did, or can play a game or two for you for your quarterback, especially if you run a system that would be one that would be appealing to draft Max Duggan too, where there's a little bit more of a run game for the quarterback. So, yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I don't think even the most ardent of TCU fans don't expect this guy to be a 17-game starter for an NFL team in the near future, but he's a guy that you'd want on your team to come in and try to win you a critical game, or spell a guy that needs to come off and get a concussion check or something like that. I think he's more than capable of carving out a role in that regard for a program that's going to value developing young quarterbacks. Which brings me to my next question. The guy that we heard most vocally talking about Max Duggan positively was good old Jerry Jones. It's obviously not the hometown, but the adopted hometown of Max Duggan, and a team that really could use a quality backup quarterback behind Dak Prescott with his injury issues. They like Cooper Rush, but Max Duggan seems like he could be a good fit in that offense. Do you see the Cowboys taking a flyer on him in one of the late rounds?
I wouldn't be surprised. Because I think that Jerry really likes the intangible side of things too, right? Like, I mean, you look at the quarterbacks that he's brought in, the Dak Prescott's, the Cooper Rushes. I mean, even Kellen Moore's was a former back quarterback for Dallas Cowboys. It's players that are very dependable on and off the field, and guys that you can kind of count on from a day-to-day basis. So I think that fit makes a ton of sense. I mean, for me, when I see Max, I was joking with a buddy a few weeks ago, but he just reminds me of Josh McCown. Like, that's just kind of the vibes I get from him. And it's not any reference to a Dallas Cowboys thing, but like Josh McCown spent like 15 years in the NFL just because of the things that he does off the field, not so much what he did on the field, right? So yeah, could the Cowboys have some interest? I mean, he's the hometown kid, played his college ball right in the state of Texas. I think it would make a lot of sense, because I think that he kind of hits those checkpoints that you really look for when you're talking about a backup quarterback in the NFL. And NFL teams are always going to value that, because everybody just wants to talk about the 32 starting quarterbacks in the NFL, but I mean, every year, we just saw a playoff stretch where guys like Tyler Huntley had to start a playoff game, where Skylar Thompson had to start a playoff game. Every single year, we see that backup quarterbacks do matter a ton, and I think that Max could carve that role out for him. Absolutely. And it could be with the Cowboys. Very possible.
And Brock Purdy, too. And it's going to be fascinating to see where Max Duggan gets drafted. When you think of Brock Purdy, and maybe didn't have the accuracy that Max displayed this year, but certainly had more physical gifts, like looks more the part of an NFL quarterback. To see him go with the last pick in the draft, and then obviously end up, I live in Northern California. I've been following Brock Purdy more closely this year than I have in his 4-year college career. But, to see him kind of go from the last pick in the draft, if you had to call it right now, is Max Duggan going to get drafted? And if so, pick around.
Yeah, I think that it's somewhere mid to late day 3. I do think he gets drafted because, again, the season he had, the resolve he has, the character he has, I would say 6th round is probably about the points. You could talk me into a round before, you could talk me into the 7th. So I think somewhere 5 to 7, but I'll go 6 right in the middle, because I just think that he just has too much of those intangibles where NFL teams have shown that they value that type of stuff. You mentioned Brock Purdy. I just mentioned Skylar Thompson, who was not an incredibly physically gifted player coming out of Kansas State, but again, had those intangible qualities that got him drafted. So I do think Max gets drafted. I just think it's somewhere mid to late day 3.
Let's talk about one of Max's favorite targets, and a guy who is looking like a potential first-round draft pick. Quentin Johnston, obviously, incredibly physically gifted. What he can do at his size with the speed that he has and the quickness that he has. He said he grew up watching guys like Tyreek Hill and the small wide receivers, and then all of a sudden he was a 6'4" guy making the same type of moves. For a while it looked like Quentin was going to be a late first-round pick. He seemed to kind of jump up into potentially being the first wide receiver off the board. And then over the last couple weeks of the season, again, as he kept playing and other guys stopped playing, he seems to have fallen somewhere in the middle of the first round. What are you hearing about QJ as an NFL prospect, and how high potentially can he go, and who's his competition to be that first wide receiver off the board?
I think that he has a very strong possibility to go top 10 to top 15 in this draft. I really do, because there's not a lot of known commodities at the top of the draft. And when I say that, it's like there's not the foregone conclusion Garrett Wilson, right? There's not the foregone conclusion Jamar Chase, like the guys that you have a very good opinion that are going to end up being wide receiver one at the next level, right? There's more the guys that are kind of fighting to get that mantra on them, to get that title. But I think that when you look at Quentin Johnston's profile, I mean, 6'4", 215 pounds, he's going to run pretty fast. The quickness that he has is an incredibly underrated part of his game, because I think that he has a lot of upside as a route runner. I don't think that he's just a vertically oriented player. Like, I think that he can break off some in-breaking routes, run routes just kind of all over the formation. I think he has that type of upside. So when you're talking about the height, weight, speed combination that he has, that's what the NFL teams go bonkers for, right? Like, they look at that guy, they're going to say, you're 6'4", running in the 4.4s. You had production, obviously, a lot of it, your last couple of years, but especially in the final year at TCU. And they're going to gamble on those traits. I mean, complete transparency, I'm not in love with the wide receiver class in 2023. I think there's a bunch of good football players, the Jordan Addisons of the world, the Joshua Downs, who I do like a lot, the Zay Flowers of the world, the Jackson Smith and Jigbas from Ohio State. Like, there's a lot of good wide receivers, but I don't know if there's a lot of wide receivers that I look at and say, that's a wide receiver one at the next level. Yeah. But I do look at Quentin Johnston and say that he could be that guy, because he has the physical traits to do it. You're not going to – Jordan Addison, no matter what you do, is going to be 5'11", 6 foot, 175 pounds, right? Quentin Johnston, you don't need to imagine what he can be. He already has those physical traits. He's 6'4", 215, and can run for days. So I think he's the first wide receiver off the board. I think there will be some conversations of the Jordan Addisons of the world when all is said and done. But I think that when you look at the height, weight, speed combination, Quentin is definitely my favorite to go first wide receiver off the board, because I think that the upside is still substantial with a player like him.
And I'd imagine he's a guy who can really help himself at the combine, that if he can run in the 4.4s, which I think TCU fully expects him to do, then I think that could certainly solidify him as the best among the bunch. He had some issues with drops, nothing overwhelming, but that's something he's going to need to showcase, I think, too. But the route tree that Sonny Dykes kind of built for him this year, the way that they used him, not just in the passing game, in the deep passing game, but across the middle of the field, and also running like jet sweeps and stuff, I think showcased his versatility in a way that'll be appealing. Does it at all hurt Quentin Johnston that the last two first-round wide receivers out of TCU will be nice and say not really panned out in the professional level? Or, I mean, is he such a standalone case because of the physical gifts that he has that nobody's going to pay attention to the two that came before him?
I'd be lying if there wasn't going to be some people out there that kind of held it against him. I mean, it's going to happen, right? Like, CJ Stroud is going to be looked at as the Ohio State quarterback this year because of what happened to the Dwayne Haskins of the world on the NFL level. The Justin Fields still kind of struggling to get his footing with the Bears consistently. Like, there's going to be that labeling, right? He's going to look at a TCU wide receiver in a spread-oriented offense under Sonny Dykes. I think it's unfair, though. I really do. So I would be lying if I didn't say that it wouldn't be out there a little bit. But I think that when you look at the situation, he's playing under a completely different head coach, a completely different era of football. And he's also got a much different skill set than like a Jalen Reagor had, right? Like, Jalen Reagor was 5'10", a $195, 200 pounds, and was supposed to be a speed merchant, right? He obviously didn't pan out. But when you look at a guy like a Quentin Johnston, I mean, he's 6'4", 215 with vines. Like, he's a completely different type of receiver. Yeah. So I think people are ultimately going to look past the TCU wide receiver thing, because they're going to say that guy is incredibly different than the last couple guys that have come out. And I know you're going to talk about Josh Doxson. He's kind of the tall wide receiver. Like, he might have some parallels. But I just think that Quentin Johnston is just a different type of athlete than the last two guys have come out. And I think that you look at it and say, also with Sonny Dykes, a completely different coach than the previous coaching staff had offensively, at least. I think you look at it and say, you kind of look past just the easy labeling of TCU wide receivers and just appreciate him for the individual that he is.
You talked about the wide receiver group not being a unit overall that you're in love with, but the running back group this year is full with a lot of big names and elite talents with Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson. And, I can go on. Those are just two Texas guys, but you can go on and on with all the talents out there. Kendre Miller, Zach Evans is another one, a former TCU guy, but Kendre Miller is a guy who doesn't really get mentioned alongside those players, but has a lot of the same physical gifts and was as or more productive than those guys, especially on the biggest stage. The running back position is undervalued, especially in the NFL draft. It feels like, and most of these teams are using multiple guys. What does Kendre need to do at the NFL Combine, and where do you see him landing in the draft this spring?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Kendre Miller. I really am. I mean, I was doing some film study on him even before this season because obviously he was sharing, a lot of the ball with Zach Evans before he transferred over to Ole Miss. And I mean, Kendre is just a really compact runner, physical, breaks a lot of tackles, and he's got deceptive speed and quickness. I don't think that he's going to go to the combine and run like 4.45. Like I think he's more probably in the 4.5s as a runner. But what I need to see from him, for me, is that I want to see those explosive numbers, right? Because I watched him on film and I'm like, the initial stop-start, the explosiveness out of stance, like all that stuff is really good. So, and he can show me, the vertical, if he can show me the broad jump, if he can show me the short area quickness stuff, that's all I need to see from the checking the box portion, because this is going to be a running back class, and you already mentioned it, with the Bijan Robinsons of the world, the Jahmyr Gibbses, the Roschon Johnsons, it is a plethora of very talented running backs, the Zach Evans of the world, that there's going to be some running backs that are going to fall down a little bit just because of pure volume, right? Like you just can't get all these guys drafted to the slot that maybe their talent deserves. So I do think Kendre is going to fall a little bit in this draft, but I don't think that is a knock against him as a football player. I think it's just a natural volume thing, because this is, in my opinion, this is the best running back draft since the draft of the Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley a few years ago. Like that was a fantastic class, and I think that's what we're seeing with a Kendre Miller this year in this class, is that there's going to be some guys that are incredibly undervalued because their talent is better than maybe if Kendre goes, let's say, in the 4th, 5th round. But at the end of the day, he's going to have a chance to make a team and make an impact because he is a really talented football player. It's just for him, he's in one of the best running back classes that we have seen in probably 15, 20 years. Like I think it's that deep.
Can Amari DeMarcado find his way onto an NFL roster? And do you think he'll be a draftable guy?
It's funny. I heard from a couple TCU fans before the year, because I actually mentioned DeMarcado's name to them, and because he had obviously only been like a 3rd-string running back throughout most of his career. And it was kind of like a running joke a little bit, it felt like. It was like, he's just kind of a guy in the background. But he really stepped up this year, man. And I thought that he did some good stuff for him. So I don't think he'll get drafted, but I think as long as he has a decent showing out of pro day and shows off, some underrated athlete, because I did think his speed and athleticism was pretty good. Like I thought he had a pretty good, combination of it. So as long as he does that, I think he'll get a priority free agent opportunity. And at that point, running back is just so dependent on what situation you fall in. I mean, we see every year these guys that are late round drafted or undrafted free agents that come in and they play a decent amount as a rookie, or they, play a decent amount their first 2 to 3 years, and they really kind of outplay the spot that they were selected or the free agent designation that they had. So I think DeMarcado is going to be a kid that is definitely going to be in a camp. There's no doubt about it. It's just about what situation he falls in and if he can take advantage of the limited reps that he's going to have in a training camp or in a OTA type of setting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the blessing and the curse of the way that the NFL looks at running backs is that you have less guys that are going to get drafted very highly, very early with the big dollar contracts, but you have more 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round guys that can stick on rosters, because you have to now have 3 or 4 guys that can play and do multiple things, whether it's pass pro, catching the ball out of the backfield, or obviously running the football. And one thing that both of those guys can do is pretty much do all of them. Kendre's going to have to become a much better pass protector, but he certainly has the body type to be able to do it effectively. Last guy kind of on the offensive side of the ball, Steve Avila. Again, just a guy that I think TCU fans have really taken for granted. But when you look at the long history of offensive linemen that have made it in the NFL out of TCU, even as bad as TCU's offensive line has been during some of those stretches, Avila seems like a natural fit as a guy because he can play multiple positions. He's so flexible in the things that he can do on the offensive line. Draftable prospect, and where do you kind of see him landing? Had a good week, too, it looked like, in Mobile.
Yeah, I think that he ultimately played himself. If there were any questions about it going into the week, I think he left Mobile as a solid late day 2 football player. Like I think that he is a player that probably hears his name in the 3rd round of the 2023 NFL draft, because I mean, Avila is a player that at 6'3 plus 335 pounds, was a little bit of an odd player because you don't usually see that body type at center, which obviously he was playing during the majority of his TCU career, that he moves over to guard this past year. And I think he really found his home. But at the end of the day, the ability to show that you can play center and guard is a big plus for NFL teams, to show that position flexibility, because there's going to be some times where an injury happens. And let's say Steve is the starting guard for a team down the road and the injury happens to center. Instead of holding a roster spot as a backup for a guy that can only play center, hey, maybe Steve's that guy that can kind of flex to different spots, right? So that's very valuable. And I think at the Senior Bowl, first day I thought he had a couple up and down reps, but then the last 2 days of practice and then into the bowl and into the All-Star game, I thought that he was just locked down from start to finish on those last couple of days. Like, he was in there, the conversation with like Osiris Torrance from Florida, John Michael Schmitz from Minnesota, is guys that are just, they're boxy looking players that just, when they get their hands on you, the rep is over. And that's what Steve brings to the table. He's an incredibly strong dude. When he gets his hands placed inside the chest plate and he gets the opportunity to sit down on power, reps are basically over. He's an incredibly strong dude who has some underrated foot quickness for his size too. Like, he's not just a bouldering dude that just can't move at all. So I think position flexibility is a big help for him. I think he had a really nice Senior Bowl week, especially the last 2 days. And I think you look at a player like him and you say, that is a starting offensive lineman at the next level. Is it year 1, year 2, year 3? That's the question that we're obviously going to kind of work through. But I think that Steve solidified himself as a late day 2 prospect because of the week that he had down in Mobile.
Yeah, and another just high character, super cerebral, smart football player, a guy that you want in your locker room, great leader, checks really all the boxes. Another guy who I thought really, that I don't think we talked about much as a next level player, but had a great week down in Mobile, was Dee Winters. He measured in really, really small for a linebacker. Can he make a team carve out a role at the next level? Is he a guy that's probably going to have to do it the hard way as an undrafted free agent, or is somebody going to like what he brings to the table and take a chance on him late?
Yeah, I mean, it was really, we expected the size because we did have preseason, measurements on him. So the fact that he measured in 5'11", 223, and I think he had 31 and a quarter inch arms, like, it's not great numbers for linebackers. Like, I mean, full transparency, it's not. But I really thought Dee played fantastically this year for TCU. And he is a player that, even though he doesn't have the biggest tackle radius, he might not be the biggest linebacker in the world, he is a really nice athlete, though, right? So I think that he has some overcompensating traits. Like, he might not be the rangiest in terms of his tackle radius, but like, the kid can move well in space and do things as a coverage linebacker. I mean, despite him being that size, he played a lot of Sam linebacker for TCU because he was just so good working in space, So I thought he had a really nice Senior Bowl week. I would be surprised if he wasn't drafted. Like, I think that he's going to be knocked until probably early to mid day 3, so 4th to 5th to 6th round, somewhere in that ballpark because of the size. But I wouldn't be surprised if long term in 2-3 years, if Dee Winters isn't a starting linebacker in the NFL. Like, I wouldn't be shocked about that at all, because I just think he has so many traits that you look at and say, that guy, might not be the tallest dude of all time, but he's just so physical, so explosive. There's things to work on there, obviously, right? The eye discipline, I think, is something that needs to be a little more consistent.
Yeah.
But when you look at the traits, I think that he has everything you look for. I mean, there's no reason that he can't be Dre Greenlaw that plays for the San Francisco 49ers. Like a similar profile, a little bit underrated coming out of Arkansas, similar to what I think Dee is. But, I mean, you saw him down the stretch for TCU. He was the guy that was making the big plays in the Big 12 championship game. And I really do think that he's going to find a niche on a roster, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's a starter in a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a guy that TCU fans are really going to be rooting for. He's kind of been a 4-year starter and one of the linchpins of this defense through some pretty turbulent times. Talked about guys that didn't quite measure in. We got to bring up Tre'vius Hodges-Tomlinson. Jim Nagy came out and said, hey, we don't invite 5'7" corners to play in the Senior Bowl. We want draftable prospects. Obviously, his height's not a secret. I think a lot of TCU fans were surprised that he actually measured in at 5'7". But he's also the Thorpe Award winner. And I'm trying to think of the last time a Thorpe Award winner wasn't drafted at any level. Tre'vius Hodges-Tomlinson plays a very physical style that he probably won't get away with as much at the next level. But he's also a guy that you talked about the intangibles with Max Duggan. THD has him in spades, and also has the last name that carries a lot of weight in NFL circles. I firmly believe that if he gets on a roster, he will stick. The question is, can he get on a roster? What do you think his chances are getting drafted, or is he also going to be a guy that picks his spot and signs as an undrafted free agent?
I think he is going to get drafted. I do. I think it's going to be a little later than maybe what his tape says, because the thing about Hodges-Tomlinson is that he is an outlier, so I understand where Jim Nagy's coming from with that, right? I mean, you don't see guys that small playing corner at the next level. Like you measured him 5'7" and 5'8", 170 something pounds and 29-inch arms, right? Like he is a historically small player at the position. So he is an outlier no matter how you paint it. And outlier doesn't, I think that people get this preconceived notion of the term outlier. Like it's this big negative, right? Like there's this big connotation around it. But Russell Wilson was an outlier, right? Aaron Donald was an outlier. It doesn't mean that you can't be successful. It just means, historically speaking, the deck is stacked against you, right? It is. So I think that for me, first and foremost, Hodges-Tomlinson's not going to be able to play on the outside at his size at the next level. Like it's just not going to happen. He doesn't have the length. He's not going to be. We talk about Quentin Johnston, right? Like you're not going to throw him out on an island against a Quentin Johnston. Like there's just too much of an advantage there. But I do think there's some appeal as a nickel corner at the next level. I do, because he plays a physical brand of football. He's willing to get his nose dirty. He's willing to play up and really be physical with guys throughout the entirety of routes. So I think there's some, and I also think that he's going to go to the combine and pro day, and I think he's going to test really well. I mean, we have a 4.4 flat estimated on him, so I think he could crack the high 4.3s potentially at his size. So I think that I think he's a player that has stick traits, like he has a sticking point at the next level, because I think he can play nickel at a decent level, and I think he can assume a role on a roster. But at the end of the day, the historical data says that it's going to be hard for him to make a roster. It's going to be, because there just hasn't been a lot of guys at his size. I think he has the disposition and the demeanor to do it. It's just going to be about a team believing in him ultimately, because scouting is an archaic form of evaluation at times, right? Like some scouts are just going to look at that size without even watching the film and say, nope, can't do it. Like you can't fit here. You can't. I've never even seen you as a football player, but the size tells me that you can't do it. So, but I ultimately do think that someone takes a flyer on him in the late rounds, and I would not be shocked if he sticks. I wouldn't, because I think that he has some of those intangibles that we keep talking about, but they matter for those day 3 undrafted free agent type of football players that need to find their way onto a roster. If you're a great person, you're a great teammate, and you can play a nice level of football for a team, you have a chance to stick. So I think he has a shot, but the deck is stacked against him. I don't think nobody can disagree with that. The history is not on his side in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment for sure. If he gets the opportunity, he'll take advantage of it, but he's going to have to get that opportunity. Last thing, kind of just whip around with some of these other guys that maybe aren't as talked about. Tay Barber, Darius Davis, Alon Ali. Is there anybody else on that TCU roster that you look at that's eligible for the draft and say, I think this guy has a shot to be an NFL player, to be a talent at the next level?
I think Darius Davis is one for sure, because he brings a lot of that special teams upside. He was a dynamic returner for TCU, and he did get invited, I believe, to the Shrine Bowl. So, there is some NFL intrigue with a player like him. Now, obviously, he's another kid that's incredibly small. He's like 5'8", 160-something pounds. So there's going to be some teams that are just like, you history is against you. But he's a player where if you're going to be that type of outlier size, you have to have a specialty trait, and he has that, right? Like he can be a dynamic punt returner. He can give you some upside as a special teamer. And he had a pretty nice season as a slot receiver for TCU as well. So I think he gives you, he gives me vibes of the kid that is now the Pro Bowl punt returner for the Dallas Cowboys that also went to TCU.
Turpin. Yeah.
Yes, Kevontae Turpin.
Yeah.
Like they're similar body types. Turpin was a little bit more of he was a little more productive of a true wide receiver on the college level, but Darius Davis brings that same type of special teams background that, again, he's probably going to be a priority free agent, because I think he's going to blow up the testing. I think he's going to run really well. He's going to test really well, but the size might limit him a little bit. But at the end of the day, to be a returner on the next level, we see guys every single year that are late round or undrafted free agent and make Pro Bowls, like Gunnar Olszewski that was with the New England Patriots. We just mentioned Kevontae Turpin. Like those guys were looked down upon because of certain limitations from a size perspective, but they found a sticking point. And I think Darius Davis does have a sticking point with the special teams upside.
And Turpin had to do it the really hard way because of his off the field issues. Darius Davis doesn't bring any of that baggage with him to the NFL, fortunately. So I think that's a pretty good whip round coverage of those TCU prospects. I was going to ask you a little bit about how people think of Sonny Dykes, but you mentioned that when you talked about Max Duggan. And so, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how many of these TCU players from the season do get drafted and then how many of them are playing significant or have a role carved out at the next level within the next couple of seasons. It feels to me like the best overall crop of guys that have a chance to stay that the Frogs have had in a long time. I mean, I think you could easily see 4, 5, 6 guys on rosters come training camp in July and August, which would be great for the future of the program. Before I let you go, Ryan, tell people where they can find your work and how they can follow the great things that you're doing as we go through the combine and into the NFL draft.
Absolutely. I appreciate you, Melissa, first and foremost, for having me on. So you can follow me on Twitter at RiseNDraft. Also run RiseNDraft.com. Kind of keep everything very basic. That's where all the, if you're a draft nerd like I am, if you just want to go and geek out on some official measurements and some, decent content, you can head over there. But you can follow me on Twitter, and I'll be having all my analysis kind of working down the stretch of draft process, because now we're into the combine circuit. Now we're going to be in the pro day circuit. So it's going to be exciting times, and I appreciate you again for having me on.
All right, last thing. Who's your pick for Sunday? Who's going to win a big game?
Unfortunately, I live right outside of Philadelphia. I'm not an Eagles fan, though. I have to pick the Eagles. I just think they have a better football team. I just really do. I hate betting against Pat Mahomes because he is the best in the business right now. But I just look at the rosters. I'm just like, man, the Eagles roster is just so complete. So unfortunately for my sanity living where I live, give me the Philadelphia Eagles, I guess.
I think if it's a team game, the Eagles win. I think if one man rises above, it's going to be Patty Mahomes. It should be a really, really fun game. Awesome, Ryan. Really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Absolutely, Melissa. Thank you.